Patricia Williams was arranging fresh lilies in the crystal vase when she heard the familiar rumble of Mike's BMW pulling into the driveway. The sound of his engine always made her stomach tighten these days, not with anticipation, but with resignation. At 64, she had learned to read the signs. He only visited when he needed something, and it had been 3 months since their last conversation. Through the lace curtains of her kitchen window, she watched him emerge from the driver's seat, adjusting his expensive charcoal suit jacket with the precise movements of a man who valued appearance above all else. Ashley followed, her designer heels clicking against the pavement as she smoothed her perfectly styled blonde hair. Even from a distance, Patricia could see the determined set of her daughter-in-law's jaw. Whatever they were here for, Ashley was the one driving it. The doorbell rang twice sharp, impatient. Patricia set down the vase carefully, her hands steadier than they had been in months. She walked slowly to the front door, her heart already preparing for disappointment. When she opened it, Mike barely looked at her. "Mom," he said curtly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." Ashley swept past Patricia, her expensive perfume overwhelming in the small entryway. She was carrying a black leather briefcase, which she clutched like a weapon. "Hello, Patricia," she said with that fake sweetness that always made Patricia's skin crawl. Patricia led them to the living room, the same one where Mike had taken his first steps 35 years ago. Now he stood in the center of it like a stranger, his arms crossed, looking at everything except her. "Can I get you coffee?" Patricia offered, trying to maintain some normalcy. "I just made a fresh pot." "This isn't a social visit," Mike said, his voice colder than she'd ever heard it. "Sit down, Mom. There's something you need to know." Her legs felt weak as she sank into her favorite armchair, the one Frank and she had picked out together 40 years ago. Ashley sat across from her, opening her briefcase with deliberate precision. Mike remained standing, towering over both of them. "The company is sold," he announced, as if he were discussing the weather. The words hit Patricia like a physical blow. "What do you mean, sold?" Ashley pulled out a thick stack of papers, setting them on the coffee table between them. "The sale went through yesterday morning," she said, her voice businesslike. "Mike has been handling all the paperwork for months." Patricia stared at the documents, her vision blurring slightly. The company Frank and she had built from nothing, the one that had provided for their family for decades, was gone. "But I'm still the majority shareholder," she whispered. Mike let out a harsh laugh. "Mom, you haven't been involved in the day-to-day operations for 3 years. Not since Dad died. You don't even understand the financials anymore." "That's not true," Patricia said, but her voice sounded small, even to her own ears. "Look at you," Ashley interjected, gesturing toward Patricia with manicured nails. "You can barely manage this house. The bills pile up on your kitchen counter for weeks. You forget appointments. Just last month, you called Mike 3 times in one day, asking about the same thing." Heat rose in Patricia's cheeks. It was true that she'd been calling Mike more frequently since Frank's death, but not because she was confused, because she was lonely, because she missed having someone to share decisions with. Mike pulled up a chair directly in front of her, his elbows on his knees. "Mom, you're 64 years old. You've been struggling since Dad passed. The company needs young leadership, fresh ideas. I can't keep watching you run it into the ground." "The company is profitable," Patricia said, her voice stronger now. "The quarterly reports show—" "The quarterly reports show what Dad set up years ago," Mike interrupted. "But the industry is changing. Technology, automation, digital marketing. You don't understand any of that." Ashley nodded sympathetically. "We're not trying to hurt you, Patricia. We're trying to protect you. The buyer paid well above market value. The money will keep you comfortable for the rest of your life." Patricia looked between them, searching for any sign of the son she'd raised, the boy who used to climb into her lap when thunderstorms scared him. Instead, she saw a man who looked at her with barely concealed impatience. "How much?" she asked quietly. Mike and Ashley exchanged a glance. $2.8 million, he said. "After taxes and fees. You'll have about $1.9 million in your account by Friday. It was a good price. Better than good, actually. But the money wasn't the point. You sold our company without even asking me." "I'm asking you now," Mike said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. "I'm asking you to sign these papers, making it official to acknowledge that the sale was in your best interest." Ashley leaned forward, her voice taking on that syrupy quality again. "Think about it. Patricia, no more board meetings, no more worrying about employee problems or market fluctuations. You can focus on what really matters. Your garden, your book club, maybe some travel." Mike stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. When he turned back, his face was hard. "The truth is, Mom, you're a burden. You have been ever since Dad died. You call me constantly with questions that any competent business owner should know. You second-guess every decision I make, even though you don't understand the modern marketplace." The word burden hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Patricia felt something inside her crack. Not break exactly, but crack, like ice beginning to thaw. "I sold Dad's company because it was the right thing to do," Mike continued, his voice rising slightly. "For the business, for the employees, and for you. Good luck with the rent on your new apartment, because this house is going to cost more to maintain than you can afford on a fixed income." Patricia sat in that chair for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Her mind was strangely calm, like the eye of a hurricane. When she finally looked up, both Mike and Ashley were watching her expectantly. "Okay," she said simply. "Good," Mike said, relief evident in his voice. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this." "Good luck," Patricia added, standing up slowly and smoothing her skirt. Mike blinked. "What?" "I said okay. Good luck." She walked toward the front door. "I assume you'll need me to sign those papers." "Where?" Ashley fumbled with the documents, clearly expecting more of a fight. Here, and initial there." Patricia signed where they indicated, her handwriting steady despite the tremor she felt inside. When she finished, she handed the pen back to Ashley and walked toward the front door. "That's it," Mike called after her. "You're not going to argue, not going to guilt-trip me about family loyalty." Patricia turned back to face him, her hand on the doorknob. "Would it change anything?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I didn't think so," she said. "Have a wonderful time in Milan. I hope the weather is nice for your honeymoon." Ashley's eyes widened. "How did you know about Milan?" Patricia smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "I know more than you think I do." After they left, Patricia sat back down in her armchair and looked around the living room. Everything was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago, yet everything had changed. The silence felt different now, not lonely, but expectant, like the moment before dawn. She reached for her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Bob, it's Patricia. I think it's time we had that conversation." Bob Stevens arrived within the hour, carrying the same worn leather satchel he'd been using since Patricia first met him 25 years ago. Her longtime attorney, and more importantly, her friend, looked exactly as she expected him to, concerned, but not surprised. "I take it Mike went through with it," he said, settling into Frank's old chair without ceremony. "Every word exactly as we predicted." Patricia poured him coffee from the pot she'd made earlier, her hands steadier now than they'd been in months. "He called me a burden. Bob," his exact words. Bob shook his head, his gray eyebrows knitting together. "I'm sorry. Patricia, I know we prepared for this, but it still must have hurt." Patricia sat across from him, cradling her own cup. "The hurt stopped surprising me years ago. What surprises me is how predictable he's become." "Shall we review the timeline?" Bob asked, pulling out a thick folder from his satchel. Patricia nodded, though she knew every detail by heart. They'd been planning this for 3 years, ever since Frank's funeral, when Mike had pulled her aside and suggested she might want to simplify her business responsibilities. It started in 1983, Patricia began, her voice taking on the cadence of a story she'd told many times before. Frank and I were both 25, fresh out of college, and completely broke. I had a business degree and a head full of ideas. He had charisma and the ability to charm investors. Bob smiled. The classic combination. Except everyone assumed Frank was the brains of the operation. Patricia set down her coffee cup with a soft clink. The bank loans were approved because of his charm. The early partnerships happened because men in the 80s were more comfortable dealing with other men, so we played the game. She walked to the mahogany desk in the corner, pulling out a framed photograph from the bottom drawer. It showed Frank and her at the ribbon cutting for their first office building. He was holding the scissors, beaming at the camera. She was standing slightly behind him, her hand on his shoulder, smiling but watching the crowd. "I was always watching," she said, more to herself than to Bob. While Frank worked the room, I was calculating who had real influence, who was just talking big, which deals would actually materialize. "And the company's structure," Bob prompted. "Officially, Frank owned 60%. I owned 40%. But the real power was in the subsidiary companies, the holding trusts, the intellectual property rights, all things I set up and managed while Frank focused on the public face of the business." She opened another drawer, this one filled with documents that Mike had never seen. When Mike joined the company 8 years ago, Frank was already showing signs of his heart condition. We knew we needed to plan for succession. Bob pulled out his reading glasses. "That's when you established the Meridian Trust." "Exactly." Patricia felt a familiar satisfaction remembering how carefully they'd constructed it. 70% of the company's actual value, the patents, the international contracts, the commercial real estate holdings, was transferred to a trust with me as the sole beneficiary. The remaining 30%, which included the day-to-day operations and the company name, stayed in the traditional corporate structure. And Mike knew none of this. Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mike knew what he wanted to know. He was so eager to prove himself, to show that he could run things better than his old-fashioned parents. He never asked the right questions. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows now, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny secrets. Patricia remembered another afternoon, almost exactly a year ago, when she'd overheard Mike on the phone in Frank's old office. "He was talking to Ashley," she said, the memory still sharp. "She was asking about the company's assets, about whether I had any real control over the finances. Mike laughed and said I was just a figurehead, that I'd never understood the business side of things anyway." Bob made a note on his legal pad. "That's when you decided to accelerate the timeline. That's when I realized my son had never really known me at all." Patricia returned to her chair, feeling the weight of decades settling around her. "For 35 years, I've been the woman behind the curtain. I've let Frank take credit for my ideas, let Mike believe I was just his scatter-brained mother who needed protection." "Why?" Bob asked gently. It was a question he'd posed many times over the years. "Because I thought it was what they needed from me." Patricia traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. Frank needed to feel like the success was his. His pride required it. And Mike? Mike needed to believe he was rescuing me from my own incompetence. It gave him purpose. But Frank knew the truth. Frank knew. Her voice softened, especially at the end. The night before he died, he made me promise something. He said, "Don't let Mike take advantage of your kindness the way I did. Make sure he learns what you're really worth." Bob leaned back in his chair, studying her with the look of someone who'd known her long enough to read between the lines. And now Mike has sold what he thinks is our entire company for $2.8 million. Patricia smiled, and this time there was definitely humor in it. What he doesn't know is that he sold about 30% of the actual value. The shell, you might say. She pulled out a financial statement from the desk drawer. The Meridian Trust holdings are worth, as of yesterday's valuation, approximately $9.2 million. The patents alone are worth $4 million. The commercial properties we own in Houston and Phoenix are worth another $3.5 million. The international distribution rights account for the rest. Bob whistled low. And Mike has no idea. Mike has spent the last 3 years telling me I don't understand modern business. He's probably right. I don't understand why you'd sell a profitable company without doing due diligence on its actual assets. The first call came at exactly 9:47 a.m. Milan time, which was 2:47 a.m., where Patricia was sitting in her kitchen, wide awake, with a cup of chamomile tea. She'd been counting down the hours, knowing that Mike and Ashley would try to access their funds first thing in the morning after their arrival. She let it ring. The second call came 3 minutes later, then another. By the fifth call, her phone was vibrating so aggressively on the kitchen table that it nearly fell to the floor. She picked it up on the sixth ring. "Hello, Mike." "Mom." His voice was strained, panic barely contained beneath a thin veneer of control. "There's a problem with the bank accounts. Some kind of technical issue. The funds from the sale aren't showing up." Patricia took a slow sip of her tea. "That's strange. Have you called the bank?" "Of course I called the bank." The veneer was already cracking. "They said the account was closed yesterday afternoon." "Closed." "Mom, how does an account just close itself?" "I wouldn't know, dear. Banking isn't really my area of expertise, as you've reminded me many times." There was a pause, and Patricia could hear Ashley's voice in the background, sharp and demanding. Mike covered the phone, but she could still make out her words. Tell her to fix it, now. Mike's voice was back, more controlled, but with an edge she'd never heard before. "Mom, I need you to call Bob. There's obviously been some kind of mistake with the paperwork. The sale money should have been deposited yesterday." "I'll call him in the morning," Patricia said pleasantly. "It's nearly 3 a.m. here. Mike, I'm sure whatever it is can wait until business hours." "No, it can't wait." The control snapped completely. "We're in Milan, Mom. We have reservations, plans. I paid for a suite at one of the most expensive hotels in Europe. Our cards aren't working either." Patricia made a sympathetic clicking sound with her tongue. "That does sound inconvenient. I hope you brought some cash for emergencies." The line went quiet, except for the sound of Mike's breathing, which was becoming increasingly ragged. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously low. "Mom, I'm going to ask you once more, and I need you to listen very carefully. Call Bob right now and find out where our money is." "Our money?" Patricia repeated the phrase slowly, tasting each word. "I wasn't aware that you and I had any joint accounts. Mike? The money from the sale, my inheritance, the $2.8 million that should be in my account right now." Patricia set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Oh, that money. Yes, I know exactly where that is." "Thank God." She heard him exhale. "It's in my account," she said simply. The silence that followed was so complete. Patricia wondered if the call had dropped. Then Mike's voice came back, barely above a whisper. "What did you say?" "I said the money is in my account, where it's always been, where it will stay." The explosion was immediate. "What the hell are you talking about? I sold the company. I have the paperwork. You signed it yourself." "Yes, you did sell the company. And yes, I did sign the papers. You sold 30% of Williams Industries for $2.8 million. Quite a good price for what you actually owned, all things considered." Patricia could hear Ashley now, her voice getting closer to the phone. "What is she saying, Mike? What is she talking about?" "Mom." Mike's voice was shaking now, whether from rage or fear. She couldn't tell. "Stop playing games. You can't do this. The company was Dad's. It's mine now." "The company name was your father's." "Yes. And the daily operations, the employee payroll, the office lease in downtown Austin, all of that was yours to sell. And you did. Congratulations." "Then where?" His voice cut off abruptly, and Patricia knew he was beginning to understand. "Where are the assets?" She finished for him. "The patents, the international contracts, the commercial real estate, the manufacturing rights, those were never part of what you inherited. Dear, those were always mine." The phone clattered, and Patricia heard Ashley's voice clearly now. "Give me that phone." "Mrs. Williams, this is Ashley. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Hello, Ashley. How's the weather in Milan?" "Never mind the weather. Mike is telling me you're claiming ownership of assets that rightfully belong to him. That's not legally possible. I've seen the incorporation papers." "You've seen some incorporation papers," Patricia corrected. "The ones Mike wanted you to see. Tell me, did you happen to review the Meridian Trust documents or the Patterson Holdings subsidiary, or perhaps the intellectual property assignments filed with the state of Delaware?" The silence told Patricia everything she needed to know. "I didn't think so," Patricia continued. "You see, Ashley, when you spend 40 years building a business, you learn to protect your interests. You learn that sometimes the most important assets are the ones that aren't written on the letterhead." Mike's voice came back on the line, and now there was definitely fear there. "Mom, you can't do this. I'm your son. We're family." "Yes, we are family, which is why you felt comfortable calling me a burden and selling what you thought was my life's work without even consulting me." Patricia stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out at the sunrise beginning to paint the sky pink. "Tell me, Mike, did you really think I was so senile that I wouldn't know what you were planning? Planning I wasn't planning anything. I was trying to help you. You were trying to help yourself to what you thought was an easy inheritance. The difference is that you were counting on me being the helpless old woman you've convinced yourself I am." Ashley grabbed the phone again. "This is elder abuse. We're going to sue you for everything you have." Patricia laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. "With what money?" "Dear, and which lawyers? The ones you haven't paid yet, because you're standing in a hotel lobby in Milan without access to funds." "We'll figure it out," Mike said, back on the line now. "I'll call everyone I know. I'll call Dad's old business partners. They'll loan me the money to fight this." "You mean the business partners whose contracts are now void because the company they partnered with no longer exists in any meaningful form?" Patricia asked. "Or perhaps you mean the ones who are currently negotiating new, more lucrative deals with Meridian Trust?" The sound that came through the phone was something between a growl and a sob. "You planned this. You planned all of this." "I prepared for it," Patricia corrected. "There's a difference. I hoped you would prove me wrong. I hoped you would show me that you valued our relationship more than you valued what you could take from me." Mike's rental car pulled into Patricia's driveway at 6:43 p.m. the following evening. She'd been watching from the kitchen window, timing their arrival with the same precision she'd once used to schedule international conference calls. They were 12 minutes later than the flight tracking app had predicted, which meant they'd probably argued about something during the drive from the airport. Patricia didn't rush to answer the door when Mike's familiar, impatient knock echoed through the house. Instead, she finished washing her dinner dishes, dried her hands carefully, and smoothed her hair before walking slowly to the entryway. Through the frosted glass, she could see two figures standing stiffly on her porch. When she opened the door, the difference in their appearance was startling. Mike's usually immaculate suit was wrinkled from travel, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held a wild, desperate look she'd never seen before. Ashley looked even worse. Her makeup was smeared, her designer clothes looked slept in, and she was clutching an oversized purse like a life preserver. "Mom," Mike said, his voice carefully controlled. "We need to talk." "Of course. Come in." They followed her to the living room, the same space where this had all begun just 4 days ago. But the dynamic had shifted completely. Where Mike had once stood confidently, now he perched on the edge of the sofa like he was ready to bolt. Ashley sat beside him, her eyes darting around the room as if she was cataloging items for potential value. "I've brought my lawyer," Mike announced, trying to reclaim some authority. "He'll be here tomorrow morning. We're going to contest the trust documents." "That's certainly your right," Patricia said pleasantly, settling into her favorite chair. "Though I should warn you that legal challenges to properly executed trusts rarely succeed, especially when there's 30 years of documentation supporting their validity." Ashley leaned forward, her composure finally cracking completely. "You can't do this to us. Patricia, we have a life planned. We have commitments. I quit my job at the hospital because Mike said we'd be set for life." "You quit your job?" Patricia raised an eyebrow. "How presumptuous of you." "We bought a house," Mike said quietly, "based on the expected sale price. The down payment is due next week." "That does sound like a problem," Patricia agreed. "Poor financial planning often leads to such difficulties." Mike's careful control slipped. "Stop playing games. You know what you've done. You've stolen what rightfully belongs to me." "Have I?" Patricia pulled out a manila folder from the side table beside her chair. "Let's review what rightfully belonged to you, shall we?" She opened the folder and spread several documents across the coffee table. Mike and Ashley leaned forward, squinting at the legal text. "This is your father's will," Patricia said, pointing to the first document. "As you can see, he left you the family business as it was legally constituted at the time of his death. That included the corporate name, the office lease, the employee contracts, and the domestic client relationships." Mike grabbed the document, scanning it frantically. "It says I inherit his share of Williams Industries, which was 60% of the company." "Correct. 60% of Williams Industries as it existed 3 years ago." Patricia pulled out another document. "However, this is the amendment your father signed 18 months before his death, formally acknowledging that the most valuable assets had been transferred to separate entities in which he held no ownership stake." "That's impossible," Ashley said, snatching the paper. "Frank wouldn't have signed away his own assets." "Frank didn't sign away anything," Patricia corrected. "Frank acknowledged what had always been true, that those assets were mine to begin with. I was the one who developed the patents, negotiated the international contracts, and purchased the commercial properties. They were never his to leave to anyone." Patricia watched Mike's face as the reality sank in. His expression cycled through confusion, anger, and finally a kind of hollow understanding. "You planned this from the beginning," he whispered. "I protected what I built," Patricia said. "Just as any smart business person would." Mike stood up abruptly and began pacing. "No, this is more than that. You let me believe I was inheriting a multi-million-dollar company. You watched me make plans, make commitments, quit my job to focus on running the business full-time. You set me up to fail. I gave you exactly what your father left you," Patricia said calmly. "If you chose to make assumptions about the value without doing proper due diligence, that's not my responsibility." "Due diligence?" Mike's voice cracked. "You're my mother. I trusted you." "Did you?" Patricia pulled out her phone and scrolled to a voice recording she'd saved from 8 months ago. Because from where I sit, it looks like you trusted that I was too stupid and too grief-stricken to notice what you were planning." Mike's voice filled the room, tiny but clear from the phone's small speaker. "Ashley, I'm telling you, she has no idea what she's sitting on. Mom thinks the company is worth maybe $3 million tops. She's always been clueless about the financials. Once I convince her to sell, we'll have enough to buy that house in Westlake and still have millions left over. The old lady will be so grateful for our help. She'll probably give us power of attorney over her personal accounts, too." The recording continued for another 30 seconds, with Mike laughing about how easy it would be to manipulate his scattered mother into making decisions that would benefit him. Ashley's face went white. "Where did you get that?" "Mike made that call from your kitchen last December when I was visiting for your housewarming party. You'd stepped out to get wine, and Mike thought I was in the bathroom. I was actually right around the corner, holding my phone." Mike sank back onto the sofa, his head in his hands. "You've been recording us." "I've been protecting myself," Patricia corrected. "Something I learned to do during 40 years of being underestimated by men who thought they were smarter than me." Patricia pulled out another phone and played a second recording, this one from Mike's conversation with his father just 6 months before Frank's death. Mike's voice. "Dad, I'm worried about Mom. She seems confused about basic business concepts lately. Maybe it's time to start transitioning her into more of an advisory role. You know. Let me handle the day-to-day operations before she makes a mistake that costs us everything." Frank's response was crystal clear. "Son, your mother has forgotten more about business than you've learned yet. If you think she's confused, you're not paying attention. She's been running circles around competitors half her age while you've been focused on the office politics." Mike's voice on the recording became petulant. "I just think fresh perspectives might be valuable. Some of her ideas seem pretty outdated." Frank's laugh was audible, even through the phone's small speaker. "Mike, your mother closed a $2 million international deal last week while you were complaining about the coffee in the break room. Maybe worry less about her perspectives and more about developing your own." When the recording ended, Mike looked physically ill. Ashley was staring at him with an expression of dawning horror. "You told me she was losing her mind," Ashley said slowly. "You said the doctors were concerned about early dementia." "I never said that," Mike protested weakly. "You absolutely said that. You said that's why we needed to act quickly, before she made decisions that would hurt the family finances." Patricia cleared her throat. "There were never any doctor's concerns about dementia. My last cognitive assessment, done as part of my annual physical 4 months ago, showed no signs of any mental decline whatsoever. I can provide you with the medical records if you'd like." Ashley turned to stare at Mike with a look of pure disgust. "You lied to me about everything." "I didn't lie," Mike said desperately. "I was trying to protect our future. Mom's getting older, and I thought—" "You thought you could steal from your own mother and convince your wife it was for her own good," Patricia finished. "The question now is what you're planning to do next." Mike looked around the room like a trapped animal. "I'll contest the trust. I'll hire the best lawyers in Texas. I'll prove that you manipulated Dad when he was sick." "With what money?" Patricia asked reasonably. "Your cards don't work. Remember, Uncle Tom paid for your plane tickets, but I doubt he's prepared to fund a prolonged legal battle against trusts that have been properly maintained for 3 decades. I'll figure something out." "You could," Patricia agreed. "Or you could accept reality and decide what kind of relationship you want to have going forward." Ashley stood up abruptly. "I'm not staying for this. Mike, fix this, or I'm done. I didn't marry someone who would lie to me about millions of dollars and then lose it all through sheer stupidity." She stormed toward the front door, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood floor. Mike started to follow her, then stopped and turned back to Patricia. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice broken. "I want you to decide whether you love me or just what you thought I could give you." Patricia said quietly, Because one of those relationships has a future and one of them doesn't. Mike stared at her for a long moment, then walked out without another word. Through the window, Patricia watched him and Ashley have what appeared to be a vicious argument beside their rental car. She got in on the passenger side, slammed the door, and they drove away. Her phone rang 20 minutes later. Mike's number. "Mom, I need a place to stay tonight. Ashley threw me out of the hotel." "The spare room is available," Patricia said. "The rent is $50 a night, and you'll need to help with housework." $50, Mom. I don't have $50. "Then I guess you'd better start figuring out how to earn some." There was a long pause. "Are you really going to make me homeless?" "I'm going to let you experience what independence looks like when you don't have a safety net," Patricia said. "Consider it an education in personal responsibility." "I'm your son." "Yes," Patricia said. "And it's time you learned what that actually means." Mike appeared on Patricia's doorstep 3 weeks later, exhausted and humbled, carrying a single suitcase. The designer suits were gone, replaced by wrinkled khakis and a polo shirt that had seen better days. His hair was unkempt, his eyes hollow from stress and sleepless nights. "Mom," he said quietly, "is that offer of the spare room still available?" Patricia studied him from the doorway. "Can you pay the $50 a night?" "I'll pay it," he said, though his voice was uncertain. "And I'll do the housework. I just need somewhere to stay while I figure out what comes next." "What comes next is up to you," Patricia said, stepping aside to let him in. "But if you're staying here, you follow my rules." The rules were simple, but non-negotiable. No drinking, no drugs, no overnight guests without permission, rent paid weekly in advance, household chores assigned and completed without complaint. Most importantly, if he wanted to be part of the family business again, he would start at the bottom and work his way up based on merit, not bloodline. Mike had spent the previous weeks sleeping on friends' couches, trying to borrow money for lawyers to contest the trust, one by one. His friends had stopped returning his calls when they realized he had no way to pay them back. Uncle Tom had refused to fund a legal battle after Bob Stevens confirmed that the trust documents were airtight. "I need to tell you something," Patricia said that first evening, as Mike sat at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup she'd made. "I've known about your intentions for 3 years." Mike looked up from his soup, startled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've known since the week after your father's funeral that you were planning to push me out of the company. When you suggested I might want to simplify my business responsibilities, I knew exactly what you were really saying." She sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. "The phone calls weren't because I was confused or lonely. Mike, they were because I was gathering information. I was listening to your tone, your questions, your assumptions about my capabilities. But you seemed—" Mike struggled for words. "You seemed lost, overwhelmed." "I was grieving," Patricia said simply. "There's a difference between grief and incompetence, though I understand why you might have confused the two." She stood and walked to the kitchen drawer, pulling out a small digital recorder. "I didn't record everything, Mike, just the conversations that mattered, the ones where you revealed your true intentions." Mike stared at the device. "How many—" "Enough." Patricia sat back down. "Enough to document your pattern of manipulation. Enough to show that you deliberately misled Ashley about my mental state. Enough to prove that you viewed me as an obstacle rather than a partner." She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Your father saw it too, before he died. He told me he was worried about your attitude toward me. He said you seemed to see him as a boss and me as a secretary, when the truth was that I was his equal partner in everything we built." Mike's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to prove myself. I wanted to show that I could run things better, that I understood modern business in a way you and Dad didn't. But you never tried to learn from us first," Patricia said. "You assumed we were outdated without ever asking why we made the decisions we did. You dismissed 40 years of experience because it didn't fit your idea of how business should work. She pulled out a folder from the drawer. Do you know what this is? Mike shook his head. These are the international contracts I negotiated while you were focused on modernizing our domestic operations. 3 deals, worth a combined $2 million over the next 5 years. I closed them all in the 6 months after your father died, while you were telling people I was losing my mental faculties. Mike stared at the documents. I had no idea. Because you never asked. You were so busy planning my retirement that you never bothered to find out what I was actually doing. Patricia's voice wasn't angry. It was sad. Mike, I spent 3 years hoping you would come to me as a partner instead of circling like a vulture. I left openings for you to ask questions, to show interest in learning rather than taking over. You never took them. What about the recording where I talked about you not understanding the business? Patricia sighed. That conversation happened the same week I was negotiating our biggest patent licensing deal. While you were on the phone with Ashley talking about my supposed incompetence, I was in video conferences with executives in Germany and Japan, securing our future for the next decade. Mike pushed his soup bowl away, no longer able to eat. So this was all a test. You were testing me. No, Mike, I was protecting myself while hoping you would choose to be better. Patricia reached across the table and touched his hand. I love you. I've always loved you. But love doesn't mean letting someone destroy what you've built because they think they deserve it more than you do. I never wanted to destroy anything. Didn't you? Patricia pulled out one more document. This is the profile of the company that bought Williams Industries from you, Stewart Industries. Do you know what they specialize in? Mike's face went pale. Asset stripping, he whispered. They buy companies, fire the employees, sell the equipment, and liquidate everything for parts. 43 families would have lost their jobs by Christmas. Mike, Linda Rodriguez, who's been our office manager for 18 years, she's 56 with a high school education. Where do you think she'd find another job that pays what we pay her? Jimmy Patterson has been with us since he was 22. His daughter just started college. How do you think he'd afford tuition after getting laid off? Mike buried his face in his hands. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Because you didn't ask. You saw a big number and dollar signs, and you didn't care about the consequences for anyone else. Patricia stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Frank had helped her plant. Your father and I built this company to take care of people. Mike, our employees, our clients, our community. You were ready to sell it to people who would destroy all of that for a quick profit. When she turned back, Mike was crying. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Mom, I was selfish and greedy and stupid, and I nearly destroyed everything Dad worked for. Everything we worked for, Patricia corrected gently. And you didn't destroy it. That's why I had to stop you. What happens now? Mike asked. Do you want me to leave? Do you never want to see me again? Patricia sat back down and looked at her son. Really looked at him. Beneath the exhaustion and shame, she could see traces of the boy she'd raised, the one who used to help her in the garden and ask endless questions about how things worked. That depends on you, she said. Do you want to learn what it really means to build something? Do you want to understand why your father and I made the choices we did? Do you want to earn your place in this family and this business, instead of just expecting it to be handed to you? Mike nodded, unable to speak. Then we start tomorrow. You'll work in every department. You'll learn how we treat our employees, how we serve our clients, how we make decisions that benefit everyone, not just ourselves. If you prove that you can put the company's well-being above your own ego, then maybe someday you'll be ready to help me run it. And if I can't prove that, then you'll have learned something valuable about yourself, and you'll find your own path. Either way, you'll be a better man than you are right now. Mike wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Why are you giving me this chance? After everything I did. Because giving up on you would mean Frank and I failed as parents, Patricia said. And because I believe there's still time for you to become the man your father hoped you'd be. That night, Patricia lay in bed thinking about the conversation. She'd taken an enormous risk. There was no guarantee that Mike would change, that he'd learn humility and respect. He could just as easily take what he learned and try to use it against her later. But Frank's words echoed in her mind. Don't let Mike take advantage of your kindness. But don't let him drown in his own mistakes either. Sometimes the only way to save someone is to let them hit bottom hard enough that they want to climb back up. Tomorrow would be the first day of finding out which kind of man her son really was. Patricia was making coffee for two, a routine that had become as natural as breathing. The morning sun streamed through windows that sparkled. Mike had cleaned them yesterday as part of his weekly responsibilities. The house had never looked better or felt more peaceful. Good morning, Mom. Mike appeared in the doorway, dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his hair still damp from the shower. The designer suits were long gone, sold months ago to help pay for basic necessities. Good morning. How did you sleep? Better than I have in years. Actually, he moved to the cabinet and pulled out 2 mugs, a gesture that had become automatic. I finished reviewing the quarterly reports last night. The German partnership is exceeding projections by 18%. Patricia smiled, handing him his coffee black, the way he'd learned to drink it when expensive coffee makers and fancy creamers were no longer in the budget. And the Tokyo expansion. The contracts should be finalized by the end of the month. Your instincts about the market timing were perfect. It had taken Mike 3 months to stop being bitter about working for his mother instead of inheriting her company. It had taken another 2 months for him to realize that he was actually learning more about business than he ever had when he thought he was entitled to success. The transformation hadn't been easy or pretty. Mike had started in the mailroom, literally sorting correspondence and learning the names of every employee. He'd worked in accounting, discovering how Patricia had built relationships with clients through careful attention to their needs rather than flashy presentations. He'd spent time in the warehouse, understanding the logistics that made their international operations possible. Most importantly, he'd learned to listen to employees who had ideas for improving efficiency, to clients who had concerns about changes in the market, to his mother, who had been trying to teach him these lessons for years while he'd been too arrogant to hear them. I have a meeting with the Henderson Group this afternoon, Patricia said, settling at the kitchen table with her coffee. Would you like to sit in? Mike's eyes lit up. Really? They're one of our biggest potential clients. They're also notoriously difficult to work with. I thought you might learn something from watching how to handle demanding customers. 6 months ago, Mike would have bristled at the suggestion that he needed to learn anything. Now, he nodded eagerly. I'd appreciate that. Should I prepare anything in advance? Review their file, study their previous partnerships, think about why they might be hesitant to work with us, and how we might address those concerns. Already done, Mike said, pulling out a notebook filled with his handwriting. I stayed up until midnight researching their corporate culture and recent market challenges. Patricia felt a familiar warmth in her chest. The same feeling she'd had when Mike was 8 years old and had spent hours building an elaborate Lego castle, determined to get every detail perfect. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost that focused, determined child. She was grateful to see glimpses of him returning. Mike, she said carefully, I want you to know that I'm proud of how hard you've been working. He looked up from his notebook, surprised. You are. I am. When you first came back, I wasn't sure if you were here because you genuinely wanted to change, or just because you had nowhere else to go. Honestly, Mike's face reddened slightly. At first, it was because I had nowhere else to go. I spent those weeks on couches planning how I was going to prove you wrong, how I was going to get back what I thought was mine. It took me a while to realize that what I thought was mine was never really mine to begin with. And now, Mike set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. Now I realize that I wasted the first 35 years of my life trying to live up to an image of Dad that wasn't even real. I thought being a man meant taking what I wanted and never asking for help. I thought strength meant never admitting when I was wrong. And what do you think now? I think Dad was successful because he was smart enough to marry someone smarter than him and humble enough to listen to her advice. Mike's voice was steady, serious. I think I missed out on 35 years of learning from the most capable person I know because I was too arrogant to see past my own assumptions. The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of Patricia's phone. The caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in months, Ashley. Mike saw the name on the screen and tensed. Are you going to answer it? I'm curious what she wants after all this time. Patricia accepted the call and put it on speaker. Hello, Ashley? Patricia, hi. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Ashley's voice was different, smaller somehow, less confident than Patricia remembered. It's fine. What can I do for you? I was wondering, is Mike there? I've been trying to reach him, but his number's been disconnected. Patricia glanced at Mike, who was shaking his head vigorously. He's here. Would you like to speak with him? Actually, I was hoping to speak with you first. I have something I need to say. Mike raised his eyebrows but didn't object when Patricia kept the phone on speaker. I owe you an apology, Ashley continued. A big one. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong to encourage Mike to do what he did. What changed your mind? Patricia asked. Life, Ashley said with a bitter laugh. After I left Mike in Austin, I moved back in with my parents. I've been job hunting for 6 months, and let me tell you, it's humbling. I forgot what it was like to actually work for things instead of just expecting them to be handed to me. I see. I also had time to think about our marriage, about the person I was when I was with Mike. I didn't like that person very much. I was entitled and greedy and completely comfortable with the idea of taking advantage of someone who'd done nothing but love and support their child. Mike was staring at the phone with an expression Patricia couldn't quite read. I called to apologize to you, Ashley continued, but also to tell Mike something important. The divorce papers are being filed this week. I'm not asking for anything except my personal belongings. I don't deserve anything more than that. Ashley, Mike said quietly, you don't have to say anything. Mike, yes, you made mistakes, but I made them worse. I pushed you to see your mother as an obstacle instead of an ally. I convinced you that taking advantage of her was somehow justified. I'm ashamed of who I was, and I'm sorry. After she hung up, Mike and Patricia sat in silence for several minutes. How do you feel? Patricia asked finally. Relieved, he said without hesitation. Sad, but relieved. The person I was when I was married to Ashley wasn't someone I liked very much either. And now, Mike looked around the kitchen, at the simple breakfast they'd shared, at the honest work waiting for both of them. Now I feel like maybe I'm becoming someone Dad would have been proud of. Your father was always proud of you, Patricia said gently. He just wanted you to be proud of yourself too. That afternoon's meeting with the Henderson group went better than Patricia had hoped. Mike asked intelligent questions, took detailed notes, and offered insights that showed he'd really done his homework. When they asked about succession planning, Patricia was able to point to Mike as their director of operations, a title he'd earned through 6 months of 60-hour weeks and flawless performance. After the clients left, Mike and Patricia sat in the conference room reviewing the notes. I think they're going to sign, he said, organizing his papers. I think so too. That was excellent work today. Mike smiled, but then his expression grew serious. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were setting up the trust structures, when you were protecting the assets from me, did you know it would end up like this, with me working for you, learning the business properly? Patricia considered the question carefully. I hoped it would, but I was prepared for the possibility that you'd walk away forever and never speak to me again. What would you have done then? I would have run the company myself until I couldn't anymore, then sold it to someone who would take care of our employees. She paused. But I would have missed you every day for the rest of my life. Mike's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry I put you through that. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting me. You didn't make me choose, Patricia said. You made a choice about what kind of son you wanted to be. I just made sure that choice had real consequences. And if I'd chosen differently, if I'd kept fighting you in court, then you would have learned that respect can't be inherited or stolen. It can only be earned. Mike nodded slowly. I think I'm finally starting to understand that. As they packed up to leave the office, Mike turned to Patricia one more time. Mom, thank you. For what? For not giving up on me, for showing me who I could become instead of just accepting who I was. Patricia smiled, thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. That's what mothers do. Mike, we love you enough to let you fail, and we love you enough to help you succeed, even when your children call you a burden, especially then, because that's when they need us most. 6 months ago, Patricia had thought she was losing her son. Instead, she'd found him the real him, underneath all the entitlement and assumptions, the man Frank and she had always hoped he'd become. It had taken losing everything for Mike to discover what actually mattered, and it had taken risking everything for Patricia to save the relationship that mattered most. As they walked out of the office together, Patricia realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not the moment you prove you're right, but the moment everyone finally understands what was worth fighting for. Now, what would you do if you were in Patricia's place? Have you ever been through something similar? The choice between protecting yourself and protecting someone you love is never easy, but sometimes it's the only way to save both. The story of Patricia Williams teaches us that sometimes the greatest act of love requires the harshest lesson. In a world where we're often told that families should forgive unconditionally, Patricia's story shows us something deeper, that true love sometimes means letting people face the consequences of their choices, even when it breaks your heart to watch. Patricia's journey reminds us that respect isn't inherited, it's earned. For 40 years, she had been the invisible architect of an empire, allowing others to take credit while she quietly built something remarkable. Her story resonates with countless women who have watched their contributions minimized, their wisdom dismissed, and their value reduced to what they can provide for others. But this isn't just a story about gender or generational conflict. It's about the fundamental human struggle between entitlement and gratitude, between taking and earning, between seeing people as obstacles or as partners. Mike's transformation from a selfish heir to a humble student shows us that it's never too late to change, but change only comes when we're forced to confront the reality of who we've become. The most powerful moment in Patricia's story isn't when she reveals her strategic brilliance or when Mike finally understands what he's lost. It's in that quiet kitchen scene 6 months later, when mother and son share coffee and conversation built on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. That's when we see what family can become when it's founded on choice rather than blood, on earned trust rather than expected loyalty. Patricia's 3-year plan wasn't about revenge, it was about salvation. She could have simply written Mike out of her will and moved on. Instead, she created a situation where he could learn who he really was beneath the entitlement and arrogance. She gave him the gift of hitting bottom so he could discover his own strength to climb back up. The story also challenges our assumptions about aging and wisdom. In a youth-obsessed culture that often dismisses older people as outdated or irrelevant, Patricia demonstrates that experience and strategic thinking are invaluable assets. Her quiet competence stands in stark contrast to Mike's flashy assumptions about modern business, showing us that true innovation often comes from deep understanding rather than surface-level trends. Perhaps most importantly, Patricia's story asks us to examine our own relationships. How often do we assume we know what someone is capable of? How often do we mistake kindness for weakness, or quiet strength for confusion? How many opportunities do we miss to learn from those around us because we're too busy proving our own worth? As you reflect on this story, consider what would you do in Patricia's position when someone you love is taking advantage of your kindness. How do you balance protection with compassion? And perhaps more uncomfortably, are there ways you might be like Mike, assuming you understand someone's value without ever really taking the time to see their full truth? The greatest victories aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they happen in quiet kitchens over morning coffee, when two people finally see each other clearly and choose to build something better together. That's the real lesson Patricia Williams has to teach us all.